Hello. Hello, everybody. I'm John. This is Andrew, Karl. We work here at Google. This is the AngularJS Meetup. If you don't know, that is HTML enhanced, which means awesome front-end framework. So today we have two speakers. We have Karl and Siarhei. They are going to be doing, well, Karl's from Google, and he's going to be doing a presentation about something he's been working on his team at DoubleClick. And Siarhei is going to be talking about how his team has been using Angular to make their business flow a little smoother on the development side. And then we have two lightning talks, possibly just one. You guys should sign up so that we have more. And if anybody feels like doing a last-minute lightning talk today, then you get a free T-shirt with Angular on it. So, yay! And I have a Chromebook in here, right here, so you can just like sign in anonymous and show whatever app you're working on or any GitHub code you have. They're just quick 5-minute talks just to show what you've been working on. And please don't use the coffee machines in the back. And if you have questions, presenters will try to repeat their questions, but just wait for a mic to come to you because we're recording right now, and then the video is going to go up to YouTube. So just make sure you get a mic in your hand before you ask a question. Karl.
All right. Everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to talk about something I made called dfa-stable-repeat. Basically a different repeater. If you've used Angular, you're probably familiar with ng-repeat, so it does basically the same thing. All right. So quickly, I don't work on the AngularJS team directly. I do work for Google on the DoubleClick team, and I do in that role write an awful lot of AngularJS code. So, all right. So, what is stable repeat? It replaces or works in place of ng-repeat, and the goal is that it is a lot faster. And there are some downsides that I had to pay in order to achieve that, which I'll go into. So. In a nutshell, what's the difference? Well, not a whole lot. This is a little bit deceiving, but we'll get into that later. All right, so just looking at ng-repeat and looking at the trade-offs that the Angular team made when they developed it, they wanted to make it as easy, simple as possible, and also they know that in the near future version of Angular, they're going to have an animation framework, and they want this to work with that. So when you look at how ng-repeat is implemented, it's going to take into account those needs. So when you look at how it watches for changes in the array you're iterating over, it'll fire an update and update the DOM for any change in that array. Like you could replace the array, you could change the contents of the array, you could change an item inside of the array. It notices, it updates. The cost there is that it has to keep a deep copy of the array it currently has in order to check for comparisons with the new one. And of course, the deep comparison is a lot more expensive than a shallow one. Similarly, they don't want to do anything that's surprising. They just want it to work. In order to get the animation to work, they basically have to ensure that for any item in your array you're iterating over, it maps to a particular DOM node. So if that item moves, if you move that from the end of the array to your beginning of your array, that DOM node moves from the end of the list, from the end of the repeater to the beginning of the repeater. And that way, someday they'll be able to animate that thing shooting up in that direction, however they decide to do that. All right, so contrast with stable repeat. I use referential comparison when I'm watching the array. So that means that all it does is compares the reference. If the array itself changes, the array reference changes, it updates. If you modify the array, if you modify the contents of the array, it doesn't notice. Has no concern for implementing animation, so I don't need to worry about a one-to-one mapping between DOM nodes and data. I just need there to be DOM nodes at all. So it has this side channel for updates. So whereas Angular's curly braces do a two-way binding, the stable repeater implements an additional one-way binding that only updates when the entire table or when the entire repeater updates. So when the array reference changes, only then do these things fire. It's a couple more esoteric features. It can render a different template than its own. I'll get into what that means later. And it can share scopes between its siblings. I'll get into what that means later as well. All All right, so just going through these features one by one. Referential comparison, much faster. Doesn't require a copy to be made. Downside, it's kind of unintuitive if you're expecting that you can add something to the array and it's just going to appear. Well, it's not going to happen. You have to make a shallow copy of the array. So it's more complex, but a good deal faster, especially if you're going to have a lot of repeaters on your page at the same time. So no concern for animation. Thanks to that, I can make the DOM nodes for this repeater once and just keep them. So for comparison, ngRepeat, as a side effect of its one-to-one mapping, if you were to remove an element from your array entirely, it destroys that DOM node. So if you were using the repeater to implement like a paginating table, you load the first page, it renders like say 50 rows, 50 DOM nodes, and then you go to the next page, it destroys all 50 of them and recreates 50 new ones. So this one, I don't do that. I say I've got 50 DOM nodes now, I've got 50 rows. All I need to do is update my bindings, and it's much less DOM manipulation that way, much faster. Downside, of course, I don't get animation, but fortunately I don't care. So stable bindings, which are kind of where the name of the table comes from, or where the name of the repeater comes from. I keep saying table because I use this to implement a table, so sorry for that. So as I said, I have this side channel for updates, which I call the stable channel. And basically, those work kind of like Angular's bindings, except that whenever, in Angular's bindings, whenever a digest cycle happens, it updates them, it updates the DOM. In my case, whenever an update to the repeater, to the repeater's array, whenever the array reference changes, you get this update. So it's far less frequent updates. And it's made with the idea that probably most of the data you bring in your array isn't going to change that often, so we don't really need to evaluate it for dirtiness every single time we're evaluating something in the page for dirtiness. So you can save a lot of cycles that way. But again, it comes at the cost of complexity because now the developers of your app need to know, well, gee, I need to know when to use a stable bind, when to use an ng bind, what does this mean? So the way that works under the hood is it exposes on its scope, which is visible to all of its children, a stable listeners array, and then all they do is just add functions to that, and it calls them when it's time to update. It's pretty simple. And I have a couple directives I've made that are compatible with that I'll get into later, perhaps. But actually, I'll just go over them now. So stable bind is just like ng bind, which is just like double curlies. Stable class is just like ng class. It's actually a subset of the features of ng class, but lets you bind a class to a DOM node. And then stable if is kind of replaces ng switch, except it's just a single if rather than a multi-value switch statement. It's a little simpler. And I'll probably have to write more in the future, just as I need to. All right, alternate template rendering. This is something probably almost all of you don't need ever, but the idea here is that you can actually specify a template that you have in your scope and have it repeatedly render that thing instead of render the node that you've got it on. I need that for this table widget I implemented, basically so that the user of the table can put in like a bunch of TRs and TDs, and then I will take their code and then substitute it in for my repeater inside of the widget's implementation. So it's pretty obscure, but it's actually a big speed up over the other ways of doing that, and better than the other ways of doing that. So, all right. So yeah, hopefully to help you understand this, like basically what I mean by another template is you actually produce a linker by compiling with the compile service some markup or like a jQuery element or something, and then you've got that in memory, and then you can basically just pass that pass that expression in, and then it will. Actually, I have a mistake there. It's supposed to be another linker, not another linker. Yeah, basically it tells it to go get that and use that instead of using. Normally it would just repeat its own div, but now it's going to repeat that another div instead. All right, so scope sharing. This is another pretty esoteric feature. So when you because of the way this table works, because I need each column of this table to be independently horizontally scrollable. So that's actually kind of the whole reason I had to do this for performance. Is that basically it requires a separate repeater for each column because each column can have its own horizontal scroll bar, but they all need to vertically scroll together. So side effect of that is I need a different repeater for each column instead of one repeater for the entire table. So what does that mean? It means I've got a lot of repeaters. B, it means each cell gets its own scope instead of each row, as would normally be the case. So in our project, we had some widgets, some directives that were expecting the entire row to have the same scope so that they could communicate with each other. Notably, we have some inline edit directives that want to know when like their sibling, like when the ones in the same row have gained or lost focus, and we were communicating that through the scope, and we couldn't anymore. So I kind of hacked in a way that you can say, you can actually share like row scopes between instances of this repeater. It's honestly ugly, and maybe I shouldn't have done it, but it works. And it's a minor speed up because I'm creating that many fewer scopes. That's a very minimal advantage, though. So it is what it is. All right. So anyway, let's a little more honest version of the difference here. So like in my first version of what's the difference, I had the curly braces in there instead of stable bind. And the fact is, you can do that. That still works exactly as it did before. But if you want to take advantage of the bindings that only update when the table or when the repeater updates, then you need to use these stable directives instead of the curly braces or ngbind. All right, so caveat, like I didn't really make an isolated benchmark here. I just this is what I was working with when I was putting this thing into my application and trying to figure out how much of an improvement it was. So for the initial page render, which was for, I'd estimate about 30 repeaters repeating over the same data, rendering about 50 rows. We saw the initial rendering pass go from almost 900 milliseconds down to just a little above 500. The big win was pagination, because, as I said, ngRepeat maps its DOM elements one-to-one with the data. So when the entirety of your data changes, all of your DOM nodes get removed, and they all get recreated. So the bad thing there is that in the ngRepeat case, rendering the second page actually takes longer than rendering the first page because you're adding in the cost of destroying the first page to the cost of rendering the second one. So when you don't have to re-render at all, then you go down to less than 100 milliseconds, which is really great. I was really pleased with that. So for the speed of digesting, this is going to be really dependent on your app, because depending on how much of your stuff can change at runtime versus how much of it changes just only when the table runs, it's going to depend on what kind of mix of like curly brace style bindings you can use versus stable bindings. On the page I tested, I saw a 58% speed improvement for digesting, but that's really, really dependent on your use case. So that's about it. I expect everyone was going to ask these questions. I would like this to be open source someday. I can't promise it anytime soon because I've got a lot of other priorities right now with my work. But hopefully I'll be able to open source this for everybody at some point. But for now, I'm just happy to share the idea in case someone else needs to do something similar. So any other questions? All right. Oh. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that animation that's on the Angular team's roadmap?
I don't know much else about it other than that it's on the roadmap for Angular 1.1. And that this is one of the things they did to be ready for it. But I'm pretty sure all it's going to be is that like you update your binding and it does exactly what you expect to do, but then also it just animates the thing getting from one place to the other instead of just going there. So in that sense, it's probably going to be kind of like core animation on Apple's dev kit, if anyone's familiar with that. But
And have you had any talk with the Angular team about doing a fast version of this? So basically a version of this that's in the core.
I have shown it to them. They were interested in some of the ideas. They don't want my implementation because I have some my project has dependencies that they don't want. Like we use underscore and full jQuery, so they can't. We'd have to re-implement it if I gave it to them anyway. I think they're also would be kind of reluctant to do something like this because they don't want to make Angular any harder than it already is for new people to learn. And maybe even admitting that you can do things faster than the default one is bad marketing. I don't know, but that's why I would love to release this as just like a third-party library because I think it's good for a lot of use cases. Probably unnecessary for most use cases, but good for when you need it.
Can you elaborate a little bit on deep save and shallow save, what the difference is?
All right, so are you familiar with like scope.$watch?
No.
No. So when you, in your controllers or directives or whatever, you can, on the scope, you can say $watch and it give it an expression or give it a function that returns a value. And then it will just check that expression for changes. And one of the there's an optional argument at the end where you can pass, where it defaults to false, but you can pass in true. If you pass in true, that changes it to deep comparison. It defaults to shallow comparison. So in the shallow comparison case, which is the one I'm using here, it just keeps an old reference around and compares it to the new one to determine if anything has changed. And it does that on every time it does. Like the magic of Angular happens because it, like, for every expression you have registered, like if you put something in curly braces in the page under the hood, that's a watch. If you explicitly call watch, that's a watch. So it goes through, on every digest cycle, it goes through all of these watches, dirty checks each of the expressions, and determines if anything's changed and if it has to then re-render whatever or do whatever it's doing in that case. So when it's obviously much faster to do this shallow. It just creates, it can be frustrating. Like, hey, I know that changed. Why didn't it update? And well, it didn't update because it didn't do a deep comparison. For our case, where we were iterating over like our, application data list, basically, it was very costly because if you imagine each of my columns had a separate repeater. Each of those repeaters was keeping a deep copy of that whole data set. And of course, having to recurse through the whole thing to compare it each time. So that adds up. If you've just got one repeater on your page, it probably doesn't matter. But when you've got 30, it does. So does that make sense?
Thank you.
When you refer to the inline element tag or on the row, could you have multiple combo boxes that would cascade and check for the value in one when you went to the other column?
So like
you pick continent, and then the next column would have the countries for that continent.
Oh, so you want to like flow into different columns of your table?
Yeah. Yes. So if they would, if each row they were able to select the continent and then a country, and
then like subsequent columns like populate with something different, or does something pop out of the drop down?
Yes, just the drop downs would have different values depending. It would be dependent on the value before it.
I don't see why not. You
Okay.
just have to implement it that way. I guess that's kind of not an answer, but yes, it's possible.
Anyone else? Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
So hello everybody, I'm not a JavaScript person, I'm actually a user experience person, but I still have a lot of fun and have a lot of benefits because we have adopted AngularJS in our practice. And today I'm going to show you how you can actually use this. Sorry. This must be better. Just hold it like this. Okay, and today I'm going to tell you, yes. I think it will work better. Yes. Sorry. I'm not a JavaScript person, I'm a user experience person, but I still have a lot of fun and, benefits because we adopted AngularJS. And today I'm going to show you what we did and what it gave us the benefits. So, as you maybe already know, that AngularJS was initially created for designers. At least it was an attempt, and actually, yes, the effort to create a business logic layer for prototypes, and mostly information architects and user experience designers, they communicate their ideas using prototypes. So creation this layer of business logic is way easier with AngularJS than it was before, using any other tool. And also we try to make our designers, our information architects, to get involved with HTML and CSS. And it was sort of, a question of weeks to make them code HTML and CSS, but it was a matter of years to make them code JavaScript. And AngularJS is sort of healing this, heal for this pain. And we have the following stuff right now. So I'm sort of lead of prototyping unit. We do create a lot of prototypes every day, and we have sort of prototyping culture already. And there were some milestones before we adopted AngularJS. One of them is that we adopt front-end developers. They're very, different from, let's say, industrial front-end engineers. They work on the edge of technology, so we do a lot of experiments with SVG, with 3D, etc., etc. So they try to push the bar. Also, we practice skip Photoshop. Due to Bootstrap by Twitter, due to jQuery UI, etc., etc., it's way easier now to start wireframing with HTML and CSS, without any gaps and without any logistics. Like, okay, this is the information architect, then graphic designer, then coder. Now we start right with HTML, and we do practice skip Photoshop approach. Also, it's very important we do DHTML, prototypes. It's not just a static stuff. It's not a clickable images. We try to implement some sort of logic into it, and this logic may be very complex. And if we got, tricky interactions, the nuances of these interactions, they really matter. And if you suggest user UI, user interface UI as a final state machine, lately it was very important to show the states, but now it's very important to show transitions as well, because sometimes transitions, badly designed transitions between states can kill your UI. So it's very important to create dynamic prototypes. And also we do practice modular design. We create modules mostly, and if you're familiar with the book by Nathan Curtis, Modular Web Design, we totally in it. And also, our company is outsourcing and outstaffing monster from Eastern Europe, and we got onshore and offshore teams. So I'm part of onshore team. We do strategy, initial input. We set up show and tell sessions. We also gather feedback and process it and create input for our offshore team, who mostly are designers and prototypers, and today they're AngularJS part prototypers. And this is how it works. So we start our prototyping with conceptual phase. We do practice a lot of visual thinking. We do a lot of, graphic facilitation, etc., etc. As user experience guys, we also create lots of deliverables, personas, concept maps, user flows, but the most meaningful thing that we start right away, creation of our prototype. And we create interactive prototype like overnight. Like yesterday we had a kickoff meeting with stakeholders, with clients, with customers, and tomorrow we knock on their door and give them interactive prototypes that they can play with and start giving us feedback right away, like very next day. And AngularJS and its native features work for us very well. They're sort of time saver for us on one hand. On the other hand, it gives us guarantees that all our prototypes that we are going to create will be maintainable. Because lately, for example, to communicate one idea, you have to create one prototype and a prototype for each idea. Currently, due to using AngularJS and the way how it is organized, we got sort of consistency and all the prototypes are maintainable. Especially scopes and directives, it helps a lot when you got a sort of team of coders. It's very easy to chunk big tasks between them and be 100% assured that if you want to replace something, or if you have to update something quickly, you can do it right away. It's all possible. So in this way, how we do our kickstart with prototypes, AngularJS saves a lot of time and give us guarantees that everything that we will create will be maintainable. Later we start to use a lot of JSON files that mimic database for us, and we also practice mashup architecture. So if you imagine a prototype, we create a solution that has a critical path, and there is a priority of the things that we have to prove as user experience concepts. So thanks to mashup architecture, we can have at some part of the application clickable images. At the other part, it will be stuff that communicates with JSON files lying next to the AngularJS folder, and the third part of the application can communicate with web services dealing with real databases. So it's quite a unique situation. You cannot do the same stuff using traditional user experience prototyping tools. And thanks to this, prototyping actually becomes sort of investment into fidelity. So we start at a very low fidelity, then little by little, part after part, we increase the fidelity of these parts, and sooner or later, at some point, when fidelity grows, our prototype becomes an application. And we're pretty sure that user experience things related to business logic and even backend services are shaped, validated, and verified. And this is the big picture. This is sort of divergence. So we start with a concept, then I go through a rough sketch and clickable mockup, and the longest run is about high fidelity interactive prototype. And at some point we figure out, okay, this is so good enough, the fidelity is so high that actually this is an application. And this is another one trick that AngularJS gives to us. We don't throw anything away. So it does not work like it used to be. Okay, I've got an idea, I communicate this idea with prototype, everybody played with it, and then we throw it away and start real development. Now we can actually do development by prototyping. It has pros and cons, but overall picture is like this. And also we use a lot of tips and tricks that we find out very healthy for our service. Let me show you. So for example, we have super busy stakeholder, but we have to communicate a very complex business logic to them. And we start using this sort of solutions. Like, okay, we have test scenario. This is sort of, menu for scenario. You set up delay like 3 seconds, and then you can play and pause these things. And using stuff initially created for test-driven development, we do communicate complex business logic to busy people. They just watch it as a movie. So what's happening to application? What is the business logic? And also, the main idea is that there is no zones of responsibility. Our main and common deliverable is a prototype, and everybody is responsible for this. So it's not possible to say like, okay, I'm a great designer, I've created a cool solution, but coders spoil everything, or like developers spoil everything. Like, we are all responsible for this prototype, and we make this prototype 24/7 available for all stakeholders, and we receive feedback like 24/7 as well, because there is no question what is the status of the project. You got your link, you just open in your browser and you can check what's actual status. So these two additional tricks that we got from using AngularJS in our practice. So the main idea is, okay, you can, have a lot of fun as JavaScript coders with AngularJS. You can save a lot of time, but also you can go further. You can build upon this sort of service, like a business inside business, like your front-end team, or if you're adopted by a user experience team, you can provide them this prototyping service as your specific business. You can grow using this, and also you can save a lot of time. And when we got to this point where we got application, you can not even stop on it, because mostly you save a lot of time and budget, and you can go further, inventing stuff, introducing new interesting stuff. And let me show you what we've created. So actually it was a project about visual data mining tool, very customizable, and we did all the business logic using this approach, and it was very okay. So it was very convenient for us to use AngularJS, because there were parts of this application, and due to this mashup architecture, we had very different levels of fidelity for every part. By little, we create high fidelity per part per page, and also we introduced a lot of visual data mining solutions, because we have saved a lot of time, and it was easier to communicate these very complex ideas to very busy people, because we had these prototypes, and it was sort of message. So our prototype is sort of business message for all the stakeholders, for all the guys who take part in the project. And it was way easier if, for example, you create a wireframe and then you start to prove how it will work, etc., etc., etc. But you have a lot of time and budget saved for traditional, business logic, and you can go further. You can make your people more creative, and they can provide solutions like this. So, thank you.
Any questions? Over here.
At what point do you use a real backend with JSON, and what point do you use a mock JSON files?
So at the very first stage, we start with clickable images or like lorem ipsum blah 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 text. But as soon as we got sort of feedback or input about the real content, we start to populate our prototype with this content, and we store it in JSON files. So JSON files are being designed as well, and it helps our backend guys very well, because, for example, if they build something on top of the legacy solution, they got sort of format from us. What do we need from them to bake for us using all these databases that they've got? And it's sort of, okay, we're done with JSON files. We send it to our backend guys and say, okay, create a web service that will give me this sort of, JSON for my requests. So it helps also to shape backend parts.
I guess the second question is, was that end-to-end testing that you showed, Angular and to E2E testing? Integration test?
Actually, I'm not I had to connect a lot of VPNs, etc., to show it. So I just had this screenshot. But actually, I can tell you how it works. We have, two links that we send. The one is like, this is the prototype, and the second is sort of this environment that you see right now. And on the left, there is just numbers for now, but mostly it's, like scenarios that you can run. And on the top, you just set a delay time, and you just, watch it as a movie. It's like play and pause, and you can go through this. And it's very convenient because, you just send an email to all the stakeholders with instructions. Okay, guys, this is the business logic we have implemented. If you want to check it out, just play this, movies.
But you have integrated the actual, I guess, testacular end-to-end.
This sort of additional trick, that we had due to usage of AngularJS.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. First, can I ask who writes the tests?
Mostly our second team, with offshore team. We have one specific role. This guy is sort of AngularJS architect. We call him so because he works, he constructs, let me try. Okay, he works on the scopes. So mostly he just creates scopes, and he is a sort of manager for directives that other guys should create this, directives. And mostly the guy who creates directives, he writes a test scenario for this part that he creates. And mostly we try to, to do real TDD, test-driven development. But we are in a sort of transition, so we write codes and tests. But soon we're going to write tests and code.
If you could also expound on what you used for graphics and what it was like to integrate Angular with what you used. Thank you.
We have a lot of inspiration from D3.js, but when we tried to start using this, we have problems with IE versions, and we use a lot of high charts, just because this, fork for SVG VML. So we sort of, we have a lot of sources of inspiration, but we ended with high charts library. But also let me show. We use actually a lot of stuff. We have sort of, all possible reports here. Something like this. Something like this. So it was, sort of R&D project, and we've been trying to introduce as much visual data mining tools into browser solution as we can. And due to, time and budget saved, due to using of AngularJS, we had a lot of time, and, it was sort of creativity. So, this tool will be probably extended like with 20 more reports or whatever, but, the modular solution and the ways how we can implement it and go like just keep spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning, we can introduce more and more and more. So
I have a question. So each app that you're building with AngularJS, are you starting to see that you're implementing jQuery UI widget the same way? Are you building a sort of library of directives that are common across your projects?
Yeah, actually no. When we have to make a kickstart, mostly we just adopt what we can get, right away. So we started with jQuery UI, but just for show and tell needs. Later, we build our own solutions, and now we are in sort of transition. We try to build our own widgets, like the most common. And thanks to native features that AngularJS had, for example, let me try it again. Okay, so for example, half of the prototype was this iterator. And all the stuff about sorting, filtering, already there, so we don't have to wait like a day or two to implement all the stuff. We have it like next day. And yes, it's an open question because we try to get as much as we can from jQuery UI tools, from Bootstrap by Twitter, and also there is a library BBC Gel, like global experience language. They got also very good, system of widgets. But little by little, we create our own, more oriented on AngularJS, like inner logic, etc., etc.
You mentioned that there were pros and cons to sort of having one project that you work on from the beginning and having sort of the mock in AngularJS and then building on top of that and then finally having the application versus, having a designer make a PSD and then go to, a prototype and then scratch that. Can you talk about the pros and the cons of that?
Yeah, sure. Actually, we adopted a principle called skip Photoshop. It came from 37 signals. So we actually do skip Photoshop right now because, we have a lot of front-end guys trained well, so it's easier for them not to start with drawing something, trying to comprehend, just, copy-paste some HTML tags and start to shape it with CSS and JavaScript. And AngularJS seed actually gives us sort of, format, sort of shape. Okay, this is the folder structure. This is how we, chunk the complex tasks. So we got a guy who thinks about, overall picture of scopes, like how many scopes there will be. Then, every guy who creates directives, they're sort of owners of these tasks related to this directive, and it's very easy to communicate with them. They just, can explain what they did, like, or you can tell them what you want from them. And whole architecture, the inner logic of AngularJS works very good for us just to keep consistency of all of it. It's not spaghetti code anymore because, like, lately we used to have, okay, like, this is designer, this is coder. Designer creates, or information architect creates wireframes or comps in Photoshop. And the matter of a coder was to provide as quickly as he can sort of new version of the prototype. And the only matter was, okay, let's make this prototype interactive. And how he did it, what he used, it was totally up to him. But now we say, okay, guys, here you got AngularJS seed. This is sort of standardization for you. And, the pages, the directives, and scopes, they work good for us just for manage all this stuff, to be pretty sure that everything is maintainable. Is it answer to your question? No?
Yeah. Are there any challenges, though? Like, I imagine it might be hard to explain to your client exactly what's going to happen when you have to, build a mock compared to just having someone throw it together in Photoshop or something.
Yes, no. Actually, we try to, the worst part of user experience designer work is try to get as many feedback as you can. If you provide images, if you provide prototype, and if you provide interactive prototype, you have different, levels of feedbacks and the quality of this feedback. And the best feedback that we can get actually with this sort of prototype. That's why we try to enforce our stakeholders, clients to communicate with us. And the easiest way is to ask them, okay, we see this solution like this, and give them the prototype. If you agree, okay, we will go further. If you disagree, give us feedback. And when they disagree, they give us feedback. And this is our trick, how we get a lot of feedback right away. That's why we try to make SAP this prototype like overnight, to have a very good flow of feedback from the very first day of development.
Hello. I just want to add some comments about this project. We work together with Siarhei. I'm a project manager of this project, and I want to add some advanced features of AngularJS from business point of view. As you know, good sales fix everything. So we have cool features like Angular seed, good documentation, and for example, TDD approach that we shown on during the presentation. Everything like this help us to sell this project from the very beginning and prove to our customer that this is the right technology for this type of R&D projects. Right now in our company, we built a lab around AngularJS. So in future, we will have not only good projects based on AngularJS, but also good specialists who know and how to work with AngularJS, and I believe we will have much more presentations in future. Thank you.
Any other questions? No?
Thank you.